Good evening, friend. I'm glad you're here. Take a slow breath. Let your shoulders soften, and let the quiet of this hour settle gently around you. Welcome to another night of Bedtime Biographies, a place where stories glow softly like lanterns guiding us through the dark. Before we begin, if you enjoy these calm late-night journeys, feel free to subscribe, leave a gentle comment, or share this episode with someone who might need a peaceful story tonight. Your presence here helps this little corner of quiet storytelling continue to grow. Thank you. Now, let's step back in time. It is the late 19th century. Europe is unhurried. Its narrow streets echo with carriage wheels, and new electric lamps shimmer faintly against the dusk. In March of 1879, in a small southern German town, the cold wind from the Alps lingers on red-tiled roofs. Inside one modest apartment, on an ordinary morning, a child has just arrived. In the world, a quiet boy with soft hair, dark eyes, and a gaze unusually still, as if he's listening for something far away. Let's stay in this moment a little longer, as if the camera is slowly finding its focus. Before the fame, before the equations, before the world would one day speak his name with reverence. Here he is simply a child, curious, gentle, wondering why the invisible behaves the way it does. Maybe that curiosity shaped the question that followed him all his life. What if the world behaves differently when we dare to look beyond the obvious? Or perhaps could knowledge itself become a quiet light, one that makes us less alone in the vastness of things? This story is not about a monument nor a myth. It is about a person moving through classrooms, narrow hallways, small rented rooms, twilight walks, letters never answered, moments of doubt and moments of quiet joy. A life without spectacle, yet one that glows softly, persistently. So settle in. Feel the bed hold you. Let your breath slow. From here, we'll drift through a century of time-old train stations, a tiny patent office, nights filled with violin music, friendships, and fractures, ideas that reshape the world, and the gentle truth that even the brightest minds carry their own shadows. Now, as the day fades and the night folds softly around us, let us begin the story, a quiet tale of light of time and of the man who spent his life trying to understand both. Chapter 1. The First Light. March 14th, 1879. The city of Ulm, wrapped in morning mist, stirred as the church bells began to toll clear and cold, as if echoing from a place beyond time. In a small house near the banks of the Danube, among the dim glimmers of his father's electrical workshop, a newborn cried for the first time. Albert Einstein, a name that would one day be bound to the word light, but at that moment was nothing more than a soft breath, a fragile life entering a world on the brink of the 20th century. Germany was then a young empire rising with the pulse of industry. Steam locomotives roared across its plains. Looms clattered in the factories. Amid this restless energy, the Einsteins were simply a middle-class Jewish family, earning their living through the trade of electrical equipment, a new technology that many still regarded with suspicion. His father, Hermann, dreamed of bringing electricity to every corner of life, though business was often difficult. His mother, Pauline, gentle and introspective, loved classical music and believed that sound could heal the human spirit. When her first son was born, she placed a small violin beside his cradle, a quiet prayer for peace. They would later recall that the boy spoke very little during his early years, enough to cause worry. Yet when he finally began to speak, his words were clear, deliberate, and surprisingly thoughtful. Pauline remembered that Albert would often say nothing at all, spending long stretches just staring at objects around him. Once, when he was 3, he stood by the window for hours, watching sunlight move through the glass. The adults called it a distraction. But in his gaze there was already something different, like a question not yet formed. When Albert turned 5, his father gave him a small gift, a compass. Herman placed it before the boy and said, "Look, no matter how you turn it, it always points the same way." The child watched the needle move slowly, silently, then whispered, "Why does it turn, Father, too?" Herman, it was a child's idle curiosity. But for Albert, it was the first moment he sensed that an unseen force was working behind all things. Years later, Einstein would recall in his memoirs that when he was 4 or 5, his father had shown him a pocket compass. The needle always pointed in the same direction, no matter how he turned it. At that moment, he wrote, "I realized there must be something hidden behind everything we see." The image of that tiny compass needle turning in the dim light of his childhood room may well have been the first spark that illuminated the course of his life. The Einstein family moved to Munich in 1880 when Albert was just 1 year old. The city was then a thriving industrial center of Germany, where new discoveries in electricity were beginning to shape a modern way of life. Hermann and his brother Jakob opened a small workshop producing electrical generators. They believed the future belonged to electricity, the artificial light that would transform everything. But military contracts and politics made business difficult. Their life was modest, yet their home pulsed with both electricity and music. Each evening, as Pauline played the piano, little Albert would sit on the floor in silence, listening to each note rise and fade. He did not understand it all, but he sensed an order in those sounds, a soft logic hidden in the melody. Later, he would say that he perceived the universe much like a piece of music, where the laws of nature were the rhythm beneath the numbers. His early years at Luitpold Elementary School were not easy. Germany at that time was steeped in a spirit of discipline and obedience, and schools had become places that valued conformity more than thought. Albert, dreamy and slow to obey, disliked standing at attention and memorizing rules. He quickly became the odd one. One teacher reportedly told him he would never amount to anything. The story may have grown with time, but it reflects how the world often treats a child who sees things differently. The Einsteins were Jewish, though Hermann and Pauline were not devout. Yet at the age of 10, Albert experienced a sudden wave of faith. He read the Bible, sang in the choir, and prayed each morning. 2 years later, that faith began to crumble. An older friend of the family, Max Talmud, a medical student, often came for dinner. He brought books, popular science works about Newton, Faraday, and Maxwell. As Albert read, he discovered that the universe did not run on miracles, but on laws. From then on, his belief in a divine will gave way to faith in the harmony of nature. Years later, Einstein would describe it in words that became a signature of his thought. "I believe in Spinoza's God, who reveals himself in the lawful harmony of the world, not in a God who concerns himself with the fates and actions of human beings." By 1889, Hermann's business was struggling. The family decided to leave Munich and seek a new beginning in northern Italy. Albert, then 10, stayed behind for a time to finish school, living in a dormitory. Those months were lonely. Winters in Munich were long and cold. The boy would sit by the lamp thinking of home, remembering the sound of his mother's violin. No letters from that time survive. Yet one can imagine the careful slanted handwriting across a notebook page. Words that must have carried a simple truth. Even longing has its shape. By 1894, the electrical workshop had failed completely. The family settled in Milan. Albert, 15, left school and wandered the Italian streets with his old violin. Among the ruins of his father's dream beneath the burning southern sun, he began to understand something profound. There are laws that human will cannot escape both in science and in life. If we pause here and look back, we can see that every thread of his destiny had already been tied: light music, the compass, silence, curiosity, and solitude. Each would return years later when he wrote his equations about time and space. Now imagine that small room in Ulm once more. Morning light spills through the window, touching the wooden table where a compass still turns. A child sits quietly watching it without blinking. Outside, the world rushes forward, trains, roaring looms, clattering power lines rising into the sky. But inside, there is only silence. A full breathing silence in which the compass needle still points in one direction, like the heart of someone learning to find his way. And somewhere within that silence, time itself seems to sigh. The first glimpse of mystery often comes from stillness. Chapter 2. The Student Out of Step. Munich in late 1889. Winter arrived early, as if trying to lay a hush over a city of factories rising by the day. The sky was a muted gray. Smoke from the workshops drifted into the mist, and the whole world seemed wrapped in a thin sheet of lead. In a small house on Lindwurmstrasse, a 10-year-old boy named Albert Einstein sat at a wooden table, a short pencil in hand, shaping lines of mathematics in a neat slanted script. Luitpold school, where he studied, was the model of late 19th century German education. Discipline reigned over imagination. Each morning, students stood rigid in rows, listening to commands that echoed like an officer's orders. Lessons were delivered as decrees. Questions were not encouraged, and curiosity was treated as a kind of disrespect. Albert did well, sometimes remarkably well. Yet he rarely pleased his teachers. He would lift his head and ask a simple why. Why is this true? Why must it be so? The question was innocent, but it clashed with the school's military spirit. Some teachers bristled. Others smiled with weary patience. He was not a rebel. He simply did not know how to fold himself into the narrow shape adults expected. During recess, he often drifted away from the crowd. His classmates hurled snowballs and chased one another across the frozen schoolyard. Albert stood by the wall, watching the snowflakes fall along their own faint trajectories. On long winter afternoons, when the light thinned behind the tall roofs, he wondered if each flake obeyed some hidden rule the human eye could not yet seize. Those half-formed thoughts made him feel more and more like an outsider in a place where wonder was considered a nuisance. Sometimes in the quiet evenings, he picked up his violin and drew out a few short phrases of Mozart. In that modest house, his mother Pauline's music mingled with her son's clumsy bow strokes, creating a small circle of warmth amid the strict rhythm of school days. The violin became the one space where he felt he could breathe. In 1890, a family friend entered his life. Max Talmud, a medical student, visited the house each week. He brought Albert popular science books by Aaron Bernstein. For the first time, Albert read about the paths of light, the pull of the earth, and the mysteries of magnetism. The dry air of the Munich classroom opened into another world. Soon he discovered Euclidean geometry. Each theorem stood before him like a crystal truth that needed no command, no instructor. Later he would call it the temple of absolute certainty. Meanwhile, the family's business was faltering. The electrical workshop had lost its contracts and debts were mounting. Tools, generators, coils of copper wire that once filled the shop now sat under a layer of dust. Hermann left early and returned late. Jakob, ever ambitious, chased one project after another. At the dinner table, the adults spoke in low voices about finances, their tone tinged with worry. Albert was still young, yet he sensed something cracking beneath the surface. In 1894, the family decided to leave for Milan in search of a new opportunity. Albert stayed behind to finish school living in a dormitory. Those months were long and cold. Without his mother's music, without the warmth of home, the 15-year-old sat at a small desk trying to adapt to a city that felt increasingly distant from him. The dormitory walls held the chill. Each morning, the factory whistles stretched across the city, calling workers to another day. For Albert, it was only a reminder that the world around him was moving to a rhythm not meant for him. On certain nights, he opened the window and looked down at the empty street where gas lamps cast a soft amber glow. He wondered how his parents were faring in Italy and when he might finally live a life not bound by the commands of others. When the principal demanded stricter obedience to school regulations, Albert understood he no longer had a place there. That year, he asked to leave. He departed Munich on a southbound train. There was no triumph, no defiance, only a quiet decision to step away from a system in which he did not belong. The train rolled through mist-filled valleys and crossed into Italy. Milan rose ahead with its red rooftops and the sound of church bells. In that unfamiliar city, the 15-year-old began piecing himself back together. A little mathematics, a little music, and a great many unanswered questions. From Munich, he carried one certainty. The mind needs freedom to breathe. That small conviction would lead him somewhere very different to a classroom that opened with questions instead of commands. A peaceful town by the Aarau River was waiting for him. Chapter 3. The Season of Wind, in Aarau. Autumn of 1895. The train pushed through the misty valleys of Aargau and halted at a small station. Einstein stepped onto the platform with one hand wrapped around the strap of his satchel. There were no marching footsteps here, no clipped commands echoing in the morning air. Before him lay a riverside town with low rooftops, a wooden bridge, and classrooms said to begin, not with answers, but with questions. The wind from the Aarau swept up the main street, carrying the damp scent of water and fallen leaves. In Munich, mornings had always started with the shrill of factory whistles. In Aarau, they opened with distant church bells and the soft rumble of a milk cart rolling across cobblestones. The 16-year-old stood there, feeling as though he had stepped into a gentler rhythm, one that welcomed his curiosity instead of asking him to hide it. Kantonsschule Aarau, the cantonal high school, greeted him with an entirely different cadence. Its principal, Jost Winteler, spoke calmly and listened fully. In the classroom, teachers explained their subjects as if in conversation. There were no strict rows, no shouted directives. The blackboard and its chalk became a place where thinking aloud felt natural. To Einstein, it was like a window opening. The air was warm, the space uncluttered, and his mind seemed to breathe after so long, holding itself tight. He boarded with the Winteler family on a hillside overlooking the river. Their home carried the sound of afternoon piano, the scent of baking bread, and the soft glow of oil lamps. Marie Winteler, the eldest daughter, was gentle and attuned to music and nature. On evening walks along the Aar, they spoke about things no one else in class cared for. The color of the river at dusk, the hush of wind through branches, the unspoken puzzles of the night sky. The feeling between them came and went lightly, yet it left a warm trace in Einstein's memory for the rest of his life. At school he studied with the eagerness of someone who had found the air he needed. Geometry and physics offered him a quiet sense of order. In lessons on electromagnetism, when Maxwell's equations appeared on the board, a thought rose and held on to him. If one could chase a beam of light at the speed of light itself, what would lie ahead? He could not yet form the question fully. But it stayed with him through the afternoons, tapping softly beneath his pencil strokes, drifting with the cold breath of the river wind along his wrist. One day, Professor Winteler brought a prism to class. Light passed through and split into stripes of color that spread across the wall. The students gasped. Einstein sat still, watching the motion of the light as though observing a living creature. He wondered why the colors always appeared in that particular order. Why red first and violet last? Perhaps within the light there was a fixed architecture, an invisible rule that shaped everything. No one answered. And it was that silence that made him feel freer than ever. At the end of the year, he produced a small manuscript written in careful italic script. Its title concerned the ether and magnetic fields. It was not a discovery, only the first attempt of a 16-year-old to touch the great questions of his time with his own lines of thought. It opened no doors then, but it marked the habit that would guide him through life. Imagine first, calculate later, to see what reason had not yet dared to say. Winter arrived and snow settled on the rooftops. Each morning the window panes blurred with frost, and the daylight had to push through 2 layers of haze before entering the classroom. He grew accustomed to this rhythm without haste or pressure. In Aarau, he learned how to let an idea stay with him long enough for its shape to grow less vague. Early in 1896, the Matura examinations came. His results were excellent in mathematics and physics. The other subjects were simply adequate. There was no grand ceremony. Only a quiet afternoon when Einstein stood on the wooden bridge looking down at the calm surface of the river, watching the thin ripples spread outward movement hidden beneath its stillness. Perhaps this gentle motion shaped the way he would one day see the world. That same year, he renounced his German citizenship. On the line asking for religious affiliation, he wrote that he belonged to none. It was not a protest. It was his way of saying that the laws of nature were foundation enough for his trust. His teachers in Aarau urged him to apply again to Zurich. This time the door opened. As he left the town, the train crossed the Aarau, its morning light reflected onto the ceiling of the carriage. Einstein looked out through the window. Aarau was small, yet it had opened a vast sky within him, a world of intuition, imagination, and questions without answers. If Munich had taught him endurance, Aarau taught him how to breathe. And sometimes finding the right breath is enough to carry someone very far. Chapter 4. The Window of Zurich. Autumn 1896. Zurich lay beneath a thin veil of mist. The small city, nestled between 2 lakes, shimmered with a quiet kind of light, soft, thoughtful, as though filtered through the mind itself. From the central station, cobblestone streets wound toward the Swiss Federal Polytechnic Zurich, where young minds gathered to learn how the world worked. Among the students walking briskly through the chill air was Albert Einstein, 17, with unruly hair, a gray coat, and eyes that glimmered with a silent curiosity. He chose to study mathematics and physics, but in his own unconventional way. Classmates recalled that, from the first year, Einstein rarely took notes. He listened, absorbed, and drifted into private thought, as if each formula on the board were opening a separate world inside him. His professors' figures of 19th century authority often grew irritated with the distracted young Swiss-German student who seemed to follow a rhythm of his own. Yet in that classroom, there was one person who watched him with quiet understanding. Mileva Maric, the only Serbian woman in the class, and one of the very few women in all of Europe then studying physics. Mileva was 3 years older than Einstein, serious, intelligent, with a reserved smile. They quickly discovered a shared language, not of emotion, but of intellect. Together they read Maxwell Helmholtz and Boltzmann. They argued about time, about the nature of light. In the small rented room on Universitätsstrasse, where Einstein studied at night, the oil lamp threw a golden glow against the wall. Two silhouettes leaned together over blank pages. Outside, the bells of St. Peter's Church tolled slowly, marking the rhythm of their hours, steady and deep. At the turn of the century, Zurich was a center of free-thinking Europe, a crossroads where social, scientific, and artistic ideas intertwined, untouched by the hand of dogma or the shadow of the military. Einstein thrived in that atmosphere. By day, he studied. By night, he sometimes brought his violin to gatherings along the Limit River, where students played and sang under the lamplight. Between melodies, he would fall silent, watching the water flow, always moving, never the same. The image of that continuous motion, the flow of time, perhaps began there, by the quiet river. By 1898, Einstein and Mileva had grown close. The letters he wrote to her, many still preserved, were filled less with declarations of love than with questions of thought. He wrote of reading Spinoza, the 17th century Dutch philosopher who believed in a God revealed through the laws of nature rather than through miracles. Mileva understood. Both seemed to see knowledge itself as a kind of silent prayer. Decades later, scholars would debate how much Mileva influenced Einstein's early work. But in those years, they were simply two young souls learning how to think together beneath the soft, luminous sky of Zurich. Mid-1899. The world still believed that Newton's laws were the absolute summit of physics. Yet Einstein had begun to doubt. In his private notes, he wrote about the relative motion of light, a question that had first taken root years earlier in Aarau. He wondered, what if space and time are not fixed, but depend on the observer? The idea had no shape yet, but it already had a pulse. That same year, his relationship with Mileva Maric met resistance. His family especially, his mother Pauline, was uneasy. She disapproved of her son's attachment to a foreign woman older than him and of a different faith. Einstein said little. He did not argue. He simply continued to write to Mileva long letters that intertwined physics with tenderness. In several that survive today, he wrote of light, of color, of the limits of perception, his tone oscillating between the scientific and the poetic. To modern readers, those letters carry something luminous between two young minds. Love and thought seem to illuminate each other. By 1900, Einstein graduated. His diploma was respectable, but not exceptional. His professor of electromagnetism, Heinrich Weber, remarked that the young man possessed an extraordinary imagination, but too little discipline. The remark was half criticism, half prophecy. After graduation, Einstein found himself unemployed. Switzerland was in an economic downturn, and the technical schools and government offices were hiring no one. He sent out dozens of applications, every one of them rejected. Zurich, once the city of intellectual light, turned cold. He rented a cheap room, gave private lessons to survive, and lived on the small income that Mileva helped to share. In letters to friends, he confessed that what frightened him was not poverty, but the loss of freedom to think. Even in hardship, he continued to work alone, writing early notes on electromagnetism and motion. Without a classroom, the world itself became his laboratory. In those final evenings in Zurich, Einstein often stood at the window of his rented room, looking down at the rain-slicked street. Light shimmered on the cobblestones, and passers-by moved like particles in a current. He thought of everything that had brought him to that moment, the compass of his childhood, the classroom in Aarau, the river Aarau, and now the light through glass. All those images connected into a single thread, not closing, only expanding. In December 1900, the first snow fell softly over the city's rooftops. Einstein packed his small suitcase and left Zurich. The student journey had ended, but the world of ideas had just begun to unfold. He carried no honors, held no research position. Yet something vast had begun to hum within him, a realization that time-light and human life were all motions within one boundless continuum. As the train pulled out of the Zurich station, he looked through the window and watched the city fade into the mist. Streetlights blurred. The lake shimmered faintly. In that quiet moment, he might have sensed a truth that would guide his life. The world is never still. Only the human mind knows how to pause and observe. Those who can see the world in motion no longer fear standing still. Chapter 5. The Clerk and the Dream, June 1902. Morning light spread gently over the city of Bern. Narrow stone streets curved along the river Aarau rooftops, sloping low toward the water. In a modest building on Kramgasse Street, a 23-year-old man began his first day at work. The small sign on the door read in German Swiss Federal Patent Office. His name appeared on the employee list, Albert Einstein, technical expert, 3rd class. His duty was to read invention descriptions and determine whether an idea was truly new. Day after day, he reviewed files about engines, electric machines, switches, and measuring instruments, the machinery of the industrial age. Outside, the modern world was moving quickly with trains, telegraphs, and streetlights. Inside the quiet office, Einstein sat before stacks of documents, a wooden pen, and the glow of a desk lamp. No one knew that within this monotony, one of the century's greatest revolutions of thought was quietly taking shape. Bern at the turn of the 20th century was peaceful and compact. At noon, he often walked along the riverbank, watching the water glide beneath the Niedeg Bridge. In the afternoons, when the clock tower of Zietglogge struck 5, he left the office and returned to his small apartment on Gerechtigkeitsgasse Street. Mileva Maric, his wife-to-be, was still in Serbia for a time, caring for their first child, Liesel, born early that same year. A daughter History would later lose almost entirely to silence. Their life was spare, simple meals, few belongings, and piles of books and papers spread across the table. Yet on those still Bern nights, when wind slipped through the window frame, Einstein would sit and write notes, not for any institution, but for himself alone. Later, that little apartment would be called his thought laboratory, a place where experiments were performed entirely within imagination. In that cramped room, ideas about light, time, and space collided like charged particles. He sometimes joked to friends that his job was perfect. It left him plenty of time to think. And he truly did think. In 1903, Einstein and Mileva were married. They registered quietly at Bern's town hall. No party, no ceremony. Einstein would later say it was a peaceful morning like any other. Their marriage was simple, threaded with both affection and strain. Mileva cared for their child and supported her husband, while Einstein lived within his pages of notes and hypotheses. To a friend, he once admitted with a smile that was only half in jest, "I live among assumptions and dreams." 1904. Einstein was promoted at the patent office, and that same year his second son, Hans Albert, was born. Around this time, he founded the Academie Olympia, a small discussion club made up of a few close friends, Conrad Habicht, Maurice Solovine, and Einstein himself. They met on Saturday evenings to read and debate the works of Kant, Poincaré, Hume, and Maxwell. Solovine would later recall that Einstein always arrived late carrying bread, cheese, and a gentle smile, then launching enthusiastically into his crazy ideas. The Bern years were the slowest of his life, but also the deepest in thought. Without a laboratory or instruments, he experimented entirely with imagination. He pictured people flying alongside beams of light clocks, ticking on two different trains, particles colliding in invisible space. These visions unfolded silently in his mind, dreams written in equations. By 1905, he had completed 4 papers that the scientific world would later call the Annus Mirabilis papers, the papers of the Miraculous Year. 4 essays that opened 4 new doors to modern physics. One explored the photoelectric effect, showing that light could behave as particles. One analyzed Brownian motion, proving the existence of atoms. One introduced the special theory of relativity, uniting space and time as 2 faces of one fabric. And the last, the shortest, only 3 pages long, presented the formula that every human being would one day know, E equals mc2. When he submitted them to Annalen der Physik, he signed simply A. Einstein Bern. No one suspected that this quiet patent clerk would shake the very foundation of classical physics. That summer, one evening in their small apartment, Mileva played the piano while Einstein sat at his desk. His eyes remained fixed on the page, but his expression softened. He told her that music and science for him were the same motion, only moving to different rhythms. Mileva smiled, and for a brief moment that tiny rented room in Bern became the center of the universe. A few months later, the journal published his papers. There was no announcement, no applause. Einstein still went to work each morning, still examined invention files. He joked with Habicht that he had been writing a few little papers, not realizing that those small papers would change physics forever. By the end of that year, Bern lay under snow. From the window of the patent office, looking out over white streets, Einstein watched snowflakes drift slowly, layer after layer, each one different in shape, yet all falling at the same pace. He smiled. Every motion, great or small, carried its own rhythm. The universe, he thought, required no miracles, only order. A man without a laboratory, without a title, had written the equation that opened a new century. When great ideas are written with bare hands, the world always finds a way to hear them. Chapter 6. The Miraculous Year. Winter in Bern passed quietly. Mornings came shrouded in mist over the Nidegg Bridge, where thin light fell across the river Aarau. In the small office of the Patent Bureau, a young clerk sat among stacks of papers, writing in a steady, careful hand. No one knew that in a few short months from that same desk, pages would emerge that would ignite one of the most brilliant years in the history of science. The year was 1905, a year the world would later call the Annus Mirabilis, the Miraculous Year. Bern, spring 1905. Each morning began with the tolling of the Zietgloge clock tower. The streets were damp and cold, and the Aarau drifted silently past the old town. In a modest third-floor apartment, Albert Einstein sat at a wooden desk surrounded by disordered papers. He had no laboratory, no assistants, only a fountain pen, a cup of cold coffee, and a violin hanging on the wall. Line by line he wrote, unaware that at that very moment, the boundaries of human knowledge were beginning to dissolve. The first paper, completed in March, explored the photoelectric effect. Einstein proved that light was not only a wave, but also composed of discrete packets of energy, what would later be called photons. The idea defied everything science then believed. Light was known to behave as a wave. It spread, it interfered, it bent. Yet Einstein showed that it could also act as particles, each carrying a specific amount of energy. When these quanta struck a metal surface, they could knock electrons free, laying the foundation for electronic solar power and modern optics. The second paper, finished in May, examined Brownian motion. From the erratic movement of tiny particles in water, Einstein demonstrated that the phenomenon was undeniable proof of the existence of atoms. Until then, many scientists still doubted whether atoms were real or merely mathematical constructs. His work ended the debate. After 1905, no one could deny that matter was built from invisible particles. In June, he sent out the third paper, The Special Theory of Relativity. It began with a simple question. If two people moving at different speeds observe the same beam of light, which one is correct? The question seemed like a riddle, yet within it lay a revolution. Einstein revealed that the speed of light is constant, unaffected by the observer's motion. Space and time were no longer separate realms. Each person carried their own sense of time and space, but together they formed one continuous fabric, a unity he called space-time. That idea overturned the very foundation of classical physics. The universe no longer had an absolute point of reference. Every motion found meaning only in relation to another. It was relativity itself that created order. Years later, Einstein would write, "The distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion." Then came September, and with it the shortest of his papers, barely 3 pages long, yet the one that forced the entire world to think anew, E equals mc2, a compact equation holding within it the deepest secret of matter. Energy and mass were not different things. They were one and the same, seen through different forms. From that moment, humanity understood that every object, even the smallest particle, held within it a vast reserve of energy, waiting to be released through transformation. The world, however, did not realize it immediately. When the papers appeared in Annalen der Physik, no newspaper reported them. In the universities of Germany, no one took notice of the name Albert Einstein. In Bern, he still arrived at the patent office each morning, examining diagrams of electrical switches and measuring devices, writing with his neat slanted hand, calm and methodical. Mileva tended to their child and kept the small apartment in order. At night, while the city slept, Einstein sat under the glow of an oil lamp, revising each formula, each symbol. Beyond the window, the snow melted, and the river Aarau flowed quietly on. That summer, he sent his manuscripts to his close friend Konrad Habicht, asking him to read them. Habicht later recalled that Einstein called the papers "my little but stubborn thought seeds," he said, that would one day take root. One of those little thoughts would indeed grow to reshape human physics forever. In the final months of the year, as printed copies began to circulate, a few young scientists in Germany and the Netherlands started to take notice. Max Planck, the father of quantum theory, read Einstein's paper on relativity, and immediately recognized its brilliance. He wrote to him a short, warm note. "I congratulate you on your brilliant work." The letter arrived in Bern one afternoon in October, inside a white envelope stamped Berlin. Einstein read it and smiled. For the first time, the world had knocked on his door. Yet outside, life remained simple. He still walked to work on foot, still looked up each day at the clock of Zietgloge Square, the great symbol of passing time, where he often reflected on the relativity of life's rhythm. Perhaps there was no better city than Bern for a man who was writing about the pulse of the universe. Here everything moved slowly, as if allowing him to hear the subtle shifting of time itself. And then one late afternoon at year's end, as light snow fell upon the rooftops, Einstein stood by the window of his office. He looked down to see figures moving through the misted streets. Reflections shimmered on the glass, half real, half illusion, like the very world he was uncovering. He realized that from the childhood compass to the formula on his desk, his life's journey had been one long search for order within the seeming chaos. The miraculous year ended in silence. No fanfare, no medals. Only a young man holding an old pen gazing out the window and smiling. Outside, the snow kept falling soft flakes, drifting at the same steady speed as though obeying the immutable law of light he had just written down. Sometimes history doesn't begin with an explosion. It begins with a steady breath in a quiet room, where one man believes the universe will understand what he is trying to say. Chapter 7. The Echo of Light. Bern, 1906. Morning unfolded as it always did. Street sweepers cleared the snow. The clock tower Zietgloge struck 8, and inside the patent office, Einstein sat among his familiar piles of documents. Yet something had changed. His colleagues now looked at him differently. His name had begun to appear in German scientific journals. Those who once saw him as merely a technical clerk were now asking, "What do you think of Planck's paper?" Einstein smiled, still modest, still rumpled, still wearing the same worn jacket. He did not yet realize that Max Planck, Germany's greatest physicist, had taken notice of him. Planck was the first to publicly support Einstein, telling colleagues that a man in Bern was shaking the foundations of physics. That story spread quietly like a small flame across Europe's scientific circles. In 1907, Einstein was invited to write a review article for a major German scientific journal. While preparing it, a new idea struck him. If energy and mass are one, then gravity, the force that pulls objects toward the Earth, must also affect light. He wrote that in a gravitational field, light itself would bend. It was the first hint of what would later become the general theory of relativity, the seed of a revolution that would take another decade to bloom. By 1910, their second son, Eduard, was born. Mileva cared for the children while Einstein worked almost without rest. Their life was simple, yet the weight of it grew. He spent more hours in thought than at home. On rainy Bern nights, Mileva sometimes opened the door to his study and found him sitting motionless, staring at a blank sheet of paper. Neither spoke. Only the sound of rain filled the silence, and between them, a quiet distance began to form. In 1909, Einstein was invited to lecture at the University of Zurich, the first major turning point of his career. After years of anonymity, he was finally recognized as a scientist. In his inaugural lecture, he urged students to never lose the sense of wonder that is what nourishes discovery. Zurich once again opened before him, though the light it cast now was different, the light of responsibility and of public attention. In the years that followed, his reputation spread quickly. invitations arrived from Prague, Berlin, and several academies across Europe. In 1911, at the Solvay Conference in Brussels, he stood among the giants of his age, Planck, Curie, Lorentz, Poincaré. In the group photograph, Einstein stands in the back row, youthful. His gaze turned slightly toward the light. No one could have known that this man, not yet 30, would soon become the symbol of human intellect for the modern world. Yet, amid rising acclaim, loneliness began to appear. Mileva grew increasingly withdrawn. Their life together was cramped, divided. He lived in a world of equations. She lived among the demands of reality and children. The love once kindled by shared intellect slowly faded beneath the weight of everyday life. In a letter to a friend, Einstein confessed that he felt lonely within his own home. In 1912, Einstein returned to Zurich to teach at ETH. There he met Elsa, his older cousin, calm, attentive, and endlessly patient. They became close friends, and soon their letters grew more frequent, more personal. Mileva could sense the distance between them hardening into a fracture. Professionally, Einstein was moving toward his first insights into the general theory of relativity. He had come to believe that space and time were not only intertwined, but curved by matter itself. Everything in the universe, he reasoned, influenced everything else. Nothing existed in isolation. The idea was not only scientific, it carried a quiet spiritual conviction that the universe was a single continuous fabric where no being stood alone. In 1913, the Prussian Academy of Sciences in Berlin invited him to become a member of honor, the highest recognition in German academia, offering him complete freedom to research without teaching obligations. Mileva resisted. She feared Berlin, the city of bright lights and deeper solitude. But Einstein knew that Berlin was the center of science, and such an invitation could not be refused. In April 1914, he went to Berlin alone. Mileva and the children stayed behind in Zurich, planning to follow. But they never did. Between them, the distance became irreparable. The letters grew shorter, then stopped altogether. A chapter of Einstein's life quietly closed. Berlin welcomed him with reverence and the brilliant glow of a new era. He entered the academy, gazing through the window at the long rows of trees lining Unter den Linden. And in that moment, he felt something strange. When glory arrives, it is not loud. It merely sharpens the silence within. That night, in an empty apartment, he opened the old suitcase he had carried from Bern and took out his violin. The music rose softly, trembling. Street lights spilled across the wall in blurred ribbons, like the curves he was seeking in his equations. Outside, Europe was drifting toward war. And inside that room, a man bowed his head over an old melody, as if bowing to time itself. Glory, when it comes, is not a shout. It is the silence between two notes. Chapter 8, Berlin. Between War and Aspiration. Berlin, Spring, 1914. The city was vast and radiant. Yet within its golden glow lingered the shadow of a coming storm. Battalions marched down Unter den Linden. Boots striking the stone mingled with brass horns and the cheers of the crowd. Inside the Prussian Academy of Sciences, among its white walls and echoing halls, Albert Einstein quietly hung his coat. He had come to Berlin alone. Mileva and the children remained in Zurich. Within these new walls, the ticking of the clock felt different, slower, emptier, but sharper. Berlin welcomed him as a new luminary. He was honored, given a private research office, and freed from teaching duties, an arrangement most scholars could only dream of. Yet as the light of recognition spread, he felt a chill instead of warmth. On those first evenings, his apartment lay empty. His pages still blank, and outside the March wind moved through the trees of Tiergarten Park. In a letter to a friend, he wrote that Berlin had offered him every condition for work except peace. In July 1914, the war began. Berlin blazed with patriotic fervor. Hundreds of scientists, artists, and professors signed a declaration in support of the conflict. Einstein refused. Together with a few friends, he signed another document, smaller, quieter, calling for peace. The act brought condemnation. He was called a traitor. But he did not respond. He walked the rain-damp streets, hands in his pockets, eyes distant. Amid the fever of the crowd, he kept his own rhythm slow, still unyielding. The war dragged on. Berlin grew darker. Electricity was rationed. Food grew scarce. By 1917, Einstein's health had collapsed from exhaustion and malnutrition. He was hospitalized with stomach illness, frail, and too weak to work. During those days of recovery, few came to visit, only a handful of colleagues, and one gentle presence, Elsa, his cousin, whom he had not seen closely in years. She brought him bread, fruit, and a few newspapers. For the first time in months, he smiled. Elsa spoke little. She sat quietly, letting him read. When he tired, she drew the curtains, poured him water, and stayed beside him in silence. After his release from the hospital, they kept in touch. Elsa lived near Tiergarten, and each afternoon, when sunlight slanted through the trees, she would stop by with a small basket of food. One day, as Einstein opened the door, he said softly that it was strange in times of war one can suddenly tell who still knows how to listen. Elsa only smiled. During that time, Einstein often thought about the body and the mind. He told a friend that illness had made him aware of the fragility of human life, but also of the endurance of will. Loneliness, instead of breaking him, only deepened his resolve. Each day he worked in silence, studying the equations of gravity and space-time. The ideas that had once taken root in Zurich were now becoming a system. He believed that gravity was not a pulling force, but the shape of space itself. Light, when passing near a massive body like the sun, would bend. He could not yet prove it, but he felt its truth. Every night as Berlin went dark from power cuts, he lit a candle and drew the curves of light across his papers. His shadow stretched along the wall, thin and long, like time itself being pulled and bent. In 1916, he finally published the General Theory of Relativity. There was no ceremony. Germany was exhausted by war, and the scientific journals carrying his work were buried among news of the fallen. Yet in that small room, Einstein felt a quiet peace. He knew he had reached a part of what he had been searching for. The world outside was different. Mileva remained in Zurich, raising their 2 sons, her health fading. The two hardly wrote anymore. The silence between them had become a kind of vacuum. And Elsa, the quiet woman, became his constant comfort. A friend later recalled asking him how he could continue working amid bombs and deprivation. Einstein had smiled and said, "When a person is absorbed in a great idea, it can become a source of warmth." That simple sentence captured his spirit in those war years. No steel, no weaponry, only the mind as shelter. By 1918, the war ended. The German Empire collapsed. Berlin descended into chaos. Crowds filled the streets. Bread and firewood were scarce. At night, gunfire mingled with cries for help. Einstein stayed frail but calm. In a letter to a colleague, he expressed his hope that scientists could unite beyond national borders, for he believed that humanity could only move forward when knowledge was guided by compassion. When the first snow of winter fell, Berlin grew still. Einstein sat by the window staring through the misted glass. The streetlights were out. Only the pale glow of snow remained. Elsa arrived with a small loaf of bread. They sat and ate in silence. Outside, the city rested like a body, recovering after a long fever. Einstein looked out and said softly that perhaps scientific discovery is also a way for human beings to feel less alone. Elsa laid a hand on his shoulder. Neither spoke again. Only the dim reflection of snow and the rhythm of two breaths in a small room at the heart of a city emerging from war. In the darkness, intellect was the only candle. And though the flame was small, it was enough to keep humanity from forgetting the way toward light. Chapter 9. Light Bending Around the Sun, 1919. Berlin, winter, 1919. The city still bore the scars of war roofs, torn open walls, streaked with plaster streets carrying the smell of smoke and burnt bread. Yet inside a small office at the Prussian Academy of Sciences, a man waited. Albert Einstein, 40 years old, hair long and unkempt, eyes sunken and dark, sat surrounded by papers. On the table lay an opened envelope, news from England, from a small island in the Atlantic on its way to him. The story had begun 3 years earlier, when Einstein published his general theory of relativity. In it, he proposed that gravity did more than pull objects toward the Earth. It could bend light itself. But to prove it, one needed a rare moment when the sun was completely obscured and the light from distant stars passed close enough to it to be seen. In 1919, for the first time since the war, science and peace met again. 2 British expeditions, organized by Arthur Eddington and Frank Dyson, set out to observe the total solar eclipse of May 29th. One group traveled to the island of Principe off the coast of West Africa, the other to Sobral, Brazil. In their luggage were telescopes, photographic plates, and copies of Einstein's paper, the work of a man who only a few years earlier had been considered a scientist from an enemy nation. Eddington believed that if light truly bent, it would prove that human intellect could rise above the borders of war. In Berlin, Einstein followed every report he could find. He did not know that far away, on the other side of the world, Eddington was gazing at the same sky, waiting for the same beam of light. On May 29th, 1919, the sun slowly slipped behind the moon. Over the island of Principe, the sky darkened. Eddington adjusted his telescope and drew a long, steady breath. In the brief 8 minutes of total darkness, he captured a series of fragile photographs. Stars near the sun's edge appeared slightly shifted outward, just as Einstein had predicted. Light, which had always been thought to travel straight, had in fact curved along the contours of space itself. The results were sent to London. The photographic plates were developed and measured with care. On November 6, 1919, the Royal Society of London held its announcement. Before a hall packed with scientists, Eddington stood and declared, "The observations are entirely in agreement with the predictions of Dr. Einstein." A murmur swept through the room. Then silence, then applause. Within hours, Einstein's name circled the world. The Times printed the headline, "Revolution in Science. New Theory of the Universe. Newtonian Ideas Overthrown." The press called him many things: the prophet of light, the man who bent the universe. In his small Berlin apartment, Einstein received the news his friends had sent. He read it slowly, then folded the paper shut. There was no cheer, no display of triumph. He simply said to a friend that it felt as though the world had just awakened from a long dream. That night, Berlin lit up again, not because peace had fully returned, but because people wanted to look at the sky, where the stars once hidden by the sun had reappeared in their rightful places. Elsa arrived carrying a newspaper with his photograph on the front page. Einstein smiled. "The world seems more interested in me than in the formula itself," he said. She replied gently, "'Cause at last people have seen what you once showed them through light." The story of bent light did more than change physics. It changed the way humanity looked at the universe and at itself. For the first time, people understood that everything in space was connected: the sun, the stars, and even the human gaze, all bound together in the same invisible fabric. In the months that followed, letters and invitations poured in from across the world. Einstein was invited to Cambridge, to Paris, and then to America. People wanted to hear him speak about the cosmos, yet he remained simple, walking to work, playing his violin, keeping his quiet humor. When someone asked how he felt about becoming famous, he only smiled and said, "Before, people didn't understand me. Now they misunderstand me." The world called him a genius. But Einstein knew the light that had found him was not a personal victory. It was a testament to the faith of the human mind in truth. That even in darkness, there exists a beam of light strong enough to bend space itself and reshape how we see the world. One winter evening, Einstein stepped out onto the balcony. The Berlin sky was clearer than it had been in years. He looked up, not searching for anything, just watching the stars. They hung there distant, their light traveling across billions of years, still bending slightly on its way to the eyes of those who looked. He smiled. Not because he had been proven right, but because the world had finally seen through the very light he had once revealed. And as light curved around the sun, humanity began to understand truth is not a straight line. After that year, the light around the sun carried him from a small room in Bern to the center of the world stage, where the radiance of fame began to fall upon the man himself. Chapter 10. The Reluctant Celebrity, Autumn 1921. On Broadway Avenue, thousands crowded the docks to welcome a ship newly arrived in New York Harbor. They were not waiting for a head of state nor a film star. The man they awaited was a thin, soft-spoken physicist with wild hair, kind eyes, and a shy smile, Albert Einstein, whose name had circled the globe after the solar eclipse of 1919. As he stepped off the ship, reporters and photographers surrounded him. Flashbulbs burst, voices rose. One journalist shouted, asking if he could explain the theory of relativity in a single sentence. Einstein simply smiled, shrugged, and murmured something too quiet for anyone to hear. They only saw him smiling faintly as he walked through the sea of people calling his name. To him, fame was not a reward, but a strange condition, like light so bright it made everything else harder to see. The voyage marked his first journey outside Europe since the war. He came to America at the invitation of Chaim Weizmann to raise funds for the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, a place he envisioned as a spiritual home of knowledge for Jews dispersed around the world. At his lectures, the halls were filled to capacity. Few in the audience understood the equations he drew, yet they listened because of his voice, calm, low, and steady, like the rhythm of waves. He spoke of light of time, of the way the universe expands and contracts like the breathing of humankind itself. When each talk ended, the audience rose in long applause. Einstein bowed, smiling gently, though in his eyes lingered a trace of distance. Elsa later recalled that night in their hotel room how he sat quietly by the window, gazing down at the glowing city. He remarked that it was strange how people could be enchanted by an idea they did not yet understand, and how easily they forgot the person behind it. After America came England, France, and Japan. Everywhere he went, he was greeted like a saint. In Tokyo, thousands of students waited for hours just to see him pass. In Jerusalem, carpets were laid beneath his steps. And in Stockholm, in November 1922, the Swedish Academy announced Albert Einstein was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics for his contributions to theoretical physics, particularly his discovery of the law of the photoelectric effect. He received the news while traveling in the Far East. A friend later recalled asking how he felt. Einstein smiled and said it was fortunate they hadn't mentioned relativity. Otherwise, he might have to keep explaining it for decades more. He did not attend the ceremony. The medal was sent to him afterward. The prize money he quietly gave to Mileva and their 2 sons, fulfilling a promise he had made long ago. Amid his many journeys, Einstein kept to his old habits. He rode his bicycle through the streets, carried his violin wherever he went, and preferred to write in cafes. He rarely wore a suit, often forgot his socks, and sometimes his keys. Hotel staff said he was always polite, quiet, yet his eyes shone with an uncanny light as if they could see through air itself into the invisible. Midday light reflected off his glasses. The sound of the violin filled a small room while the streets outside swelled with people. Glory arrived hand in hand with solitude. Everywhere he went, there were flowers, flags, and songs. Yet among the crowds, Einstein felt more alone than ever. He missed Berlin, the silent room, the nights when there was nothing but the scratch of his pen and the flicker of a candle. Fame to him was a blinding kind of light, one that illuminated even the corners he wished to keep private. Many sought him out not for science but for curiosity. Journalists asked about religion, politics, and love. He smiled, said little, and avoided long answers. In letters to friends, he admitted that he never felt comfortable with public admiration. He believed that when people begin to worship an image, they often forget the idea behind it. Adoration in his eyes was like a dazzling mirror. It reflected the face, but obscured the spirit within. By the late 1920s, the world still chanted his name. But Einstein had grown quieter. He withdrew into his work, steering clear of noise and ceremony. On free days, he cycled around Lake Wannsee, hair flying in the wind, smiling with the pure joy of a child. Passers-by who saw him could hardly believe this was the man who had changed modern physics. Someone once asked him, after all the honors and acclaim, what brought him the most happiness. He answered simply, "Perhaps my greatest joy is playing the violin without thinking of anything at all." A simple reply without philosophy. Yet it revealed everything he had never sought: glory, only the freedom of the mind. The old bicycle rolled along a sunlit path. Wind in his hair, light shimmering across the lake, simple, peaceful, free. And through all the noise, he kept one quiet ritual to look inward as one looks into a flat mirror. In that reflection, he saw not a genius, not a famous man, but a human being still trying to understand why the universe moves as it does, and why the human heart can feel so lonely amid the infinite. To him, fame was a shadow. Simplicity was the source of light. The brightness of fame could dazzle the world, but for him it was merely a chance to see himself more clearly in silence, in steady breath within a world moving too fast. And slowly, within the glare of recognition, Einstein began to search for another kind of light, one not born from the crowd, but from within himself. Chapter 11. Tagore. A Conversation About God. Berlin, summer 1930. That morning, sunlight streamed through the trees of Tiergarten, spilling over the pale facades of Dahlem's quiet streets. The air carried the mingled sounds of carriage wheels and tram bells, warm, clear, alive. Einstein, now known across the world, still lived simply white walls, a small garden, a wooden desk, a few stacks of books, and an old violin resting by the window. He kept his distance from ceremonies and honors, devoting his time instead to music, close friends, and long reflective silences. In those tranquil days, Berlin welcomed a guest from the East, Rabindranath Tagore, the poet-philosopher and first Asian laureate of the Nobel Prize in Literature. Tagore carried with him a different kind of light, not the sharp glow of reason, but the soft radiance of spirit and art. Two men, two worlds that seemed opposite, one born from equations, the other from poetry, met on a clear morning in a sunlit room where open windows looked out onto a pale green garden. Einstein greeted his guest with a gentle smile. He wore his familiar high-collared sweater hair, tousled eyes, tired but bright. Tagore bowed slightly, his demeanor calm, his gaze kind and deep. On the table, a pot of tea steamed softly. Light filtered through the thin curtains resting on their faces, one firm, one serene. It is said they spoke for nearly an hour, a rare dialogue between poetry and science. Not a formal meeting, not a debate, but two minds reaching toward the same question, the nature of reality. Einstein spoke of the order of the universe, a world existing independently of human perception, governed by natural laws that moved with the harmony of a perfect symphony. Tagore answered from within that the world gains meaning only through the human capacity to perceive it. That truth itself is a form of beauty. There was no contradiction between them, only two clear streams running side by side, transparent, gentle, occasionally reflecting one another. The room fell quiet, broken only by the ticking of a clock. Tagore turned toward the window where a breeze stirred the leaves. Einstein poured more tea, lifted his eyes, and nodded softly to his guest. In that moment, it seemed both men understood they were speaking of the same thing, only in different languages, one in mathematics, the other in poetry. Light slanted across the teacups. Steam rose in a delicate curve like the arc of light bending through space, the very path Einstein had once drawn in his equations. Afterward, the transcript of their conversation was published in newspapers across India and Europe, becoming one of the most remarkable dialogues of the century. People would later say that morning was when science and poetry mirrored each other, not to argue what was true or false, but to affirm that the world could be understood through both the mind and the heart. Einstein would later say that he admired Tagore's calm and luminous intellect, a man who believed in the spirit without abandoning reason. Tagore, as his students recalled, once said he had met a mind as transparent as crystal. Neither of them found a final answer, but they discovered something rarer, harmony. It was what both had been traveling toward from opposite directions all their lives. Sunlight flickered across the white walls of the Dahlem house. Steam from the tea dissolved into the warm air, and the quiet brightness between the two men opened into a small field of peace. That year, Berlin too was changing. After the war, the city had returned to music, philosophy, and art. In the cafes along Unter den Linden, people read Freud, listened to jazz, and debated Picasso. The world seemed to be waking from a long dream. And amid that hum of rebirth, Einstein chose silence. He wrote less, played his violin more, and each afternoon strolled with Elsa around the lake. Sometimes Elsa said he would stop by the water. The streetlights rippled on the surface, breaking into trembling circles like equations slowly dissolving. When she asked what he was thinking, Einstein only smiled, saying nothing. Perhaps his mind wandered back to that morning in Dahlem, when two men had spoken of God, but truly, they had been speaking of human faith in the beauty of the world. After that meeting, something in Einstein's tone began to change. In his essays and lectures, he no longer spoke of truth as an absolute law, but as a melody, at times strong, at times tender, yet always carrying the hidden harmony of nature. People heard him speak more often of the harmony of the universe than of the laws of physics. He remained a scientist, but the light within him had shifted softer, deeper, more compassionate. When Tagore rose to leave, the afternoon light tilted through the window. The two men shook hands. No one knows what else they said, perhaps only words of thanks, or perhaps a silence filled with understanding. The door closed. In the room remained the faint scent of cooled tea, a curtain swaying gently, and the whisper of wind passing through the frame. Einstein stayed looking out into the garden. The last light of day faded across the table, where two teacups were still warm. No more words were needed. The meeting had not been to reach a conclusion, but to affirm something greater, that between the two distant shores of human intellect, there exists a bridge of light where people can meet in respect and wonder before the universe. Perhaps knowledge itself is nothing more than humanity learning how to speak with God through the language of the world. Chapter 12. Exile and Darkness. Early 1933. Berlin was cold. Snow thickened on the rooftops, and northern winds lashed through the familiar streets. Yet beneath the winter chill, something colder was spreading fear. On the radio, Adolf Hitler's voice rang out amid waves of frenzied cheers. The Nazis had come to power. The swastika flag began to appear on buildings and schools, and even at the Prussian Academy of Sciences, where Einstein had once worked. One morning he awoke to find his own photograph printed in the papers with a black mark across it. Einstein said nothing. He understood the time to leave had come. That March, he departed Berlin first to Belgium, then to England, and finally to Princeton, New Jersey, which would become his last home. His Berlin apartment was ransacked, his property seized. Former colleagues, the very men who had once shared his desk and coffee, now turned away or kept silent. When the Academy wrote asking if he intended to return, Einstein replied that he could not work in a country where books are burned and freedom is trampled. Aboard the ship to America, he often stood alone on deck, the wind tearing through his graying hair. Behind him, Europe receded into a gray mist. Elsa later recalled that he stood like that for nearly an hour, wordless. When she asked what he was thinking, he said quietly, "It feels as if I'm watching a world set fire to itself." America welcomed him warmly, but his heart remained heavy. He began teaching at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. The room was small, the desk buried under papers and drafts. Here he was no longer a national symbol, only a refugee, a survivor of reason in an age gone mad. Each day he walked to the institute, pipe in hand, thinner, paler, his hair now silver. Young students sometimes stopped and watched him pass, their eyes full of awe. He would simply nod, smile faintly, and keep walking. In his letters from this time, Einstein wrote of the sorrow of exile, the pain of losing not only a homeland, but also the belief that humanity had learned anything from war. He saw the hatred spreading through Europe as the thickest darkness that reason had ever had to walk through. During his early years in Princeton, he spent much time with music and Jewish relief work. Together with friends, He helped create funds for German refugees, writing to governments, urging them to open their borders to those fleeing fascism. At night, when the city lay still, he played his violin in the small study. The notes were thin and clear, sometimes breaking like quiet sobs. Elsa said that was the only way he knew how to pray. Mid-1939. The world was on the brink of war when two Hungarian physicists, Leo Szilard and Eugene Wigner, came to visit Einstein in Princeton. They spoke of uranium, of the possibility of creating a weapon unlike anything known before. Einstein listened in silence for a long time. Finally moved by the fear that Nazi Germany might build such a bomb first, he agreed to sign a letter addressed to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. That letter, written with caution and anxiety, inadvertently set in motion the Manhattan Project, though Einstein himself took no part in it. Years later, when he learned that the bomb had fallen on Hiroshima, he told his friends he felt as though he had touched a door that should never have been opened. The war swept across the world like a black wind. Many of his old friends did not return. Berlin burned under bombs glowing red through the night. In his house in Princeton, Einstein sat alone by the window, watching snow settle on the steps outside. He confided to his lifelong friend Michel Besso that human reason seemed never enough to save mankind from its own instincts. He would never return to Germany. Even after the war, when the German government invited him to come back, he refused. He said that his homeland was now any place where truth is still respected. One spring morning in 1945, as the war neared its end, Einstein walked along the river near Princeton. Sunlight stretched across the surface of the water, reflecting the slow drift of white clouds. He stopped and listened to the wind. At 66, he had lived through 2 world wars, had seen the world destroy itself twice, and still believed that humankind could learn to be better. His reflection appeared on the water, small but clear. Perhaps in that quiet moment, he understood that he no longer belonged to any single nation, but only to the one thing he had always believed, in the kindness of the human spirit and the light of reason. Years later, when he wrote about that period, Einstein said that when one's homeland is lost, memory becomes the only country left. And within that memory, he still held on to a fragment of light, a light no war could ever extinguish. The darkness was vast and heavy, but somewhere within it, a single quiet lamp kept humanity breathing. Chapter 13. The Blade of Intellect, summer 1945. The sky of the world flared bright, then went dark again in a single flash of destruction. The news of Hiroshima reached Princeton on an August afternoon. Einstein was in his small office, surrounded by unfinished manuscripts. A colleague entered and handed him a newspaper. The headline stretched across the page: "Atomic Bomb Dropped on Japan." He held the paper silently for a long time. No one knew what went through his mind in that moment. Elsa had died in 1936. The house was now filled only with the sound of wind and a ticking clock. People said he sat the whole afternoon without speaking. Then, as evening fell, went walking around the lake as if needing space just to breathe. His shadow stretched long across the water. The very light once called knowledge now shone back as ash. In the months that followed, Einstein received hundreds of letters, some praising him, others condemning. He replied to a few. To his friends, he said only that he felt as though he had helped open a door humanity was not ready to walk through. He was once quoted as saying, "If I had known they were going to do this, I would have become a watchmaker." He did not regret warning Roosevelt about Nazi research, but he grieved that his warning had led humanity down another path the path of power instead of understanding. At 66, he devoted most of his time to writing about peace. He joined committees opposing the arms race and sent letters to the United Nations urging nuclear control. Years later, these efforts would culminate in the Russell-Einstein Manifesto. In one speech he said, "The release of atomic power has changed everything except our way of thinking, and thus we drift toward unparalleled catastrophe." To him, intellect was a double-edged blade, one edge lit by understanding the other, shadowed by ambition. He once told his students that science was like climbing a mountain. The higher one ascends, the clearer one sees the abyss below. Each morning he still walked to the Institute for Advanced Study, as he always had, pipe in hand, sweater slightly worn. He spoke kindly with students, explaining his new pursuit, a unified field theory, a dream of reconnecting the scattered fragments of physics into one harmonious whole. But that dream never found completion. The equations remained unfinished, and the universe, though it could be described in numbers, still lived beyond the reach of human hands. In the evenings, he returned to his small house, brewed his own tea, turned on the radio to listen to Bach, and wrote until late into the night. In a letter to Michel Besso, he once wrote that perhaps humanity must learn compassion as quickly as it learns mathematics. Otherwise, knowledge will remain a sharpened blade without a handle. A neighbor later recalled that on some nights, the light in his study stayed on. But he would sit still for hours writing nothing, not even smoking, just staring at a blank sheet of paper, as if within that white space he could see the entire world, a world he had helped to open but could no longer control. In 1947, his face appeared on the cover of Time magazine's Silver Hair, unkempt eyes tired yet deep. Next to him was the image of an atomic explosion, and beneath it, the caption, "The Man Who Changed the World." Einstein never read the issue. He simply remarked that no one truly changes the world. The world only reshapes itself when the mind is tested. In an interview in 1949, when asked what still gave him hope, Einstein replied, "When I look at the smiles of children, I know that reason has not yet died." In the final years of that decade, Einstein spoke less. He no longer debated physics as fiercely as before. Instead, he turned toward philosophy, music, and long letters to friends. He once said that the smarter people become, the more they must learn to be gentle, because only in gentleness can intellect avoid turning into a blade. On his desk, among countless manuscripts and calculations, there was a single unfinished page. The last line stopped midway. There is no path to peace. Peace is the path. No one knows what he intended to write next. Perhaps he was merely translating a thought into words. Perhaps he was writing only for himself. Outside, winter settled over Princeton. Snow covered the rooftops and the window where he used to gaze out. And in that silence, light still filtered through the curtain, thin and slow, like the breath of a man who had come to understand that intellect, in the end, is only a tool for learning how to be kind. Chapter 14. Bohr, Dice, and God. Winter 1950. Snow lay heavy across the rooftops of Princeton. Inside a small, dimly lit study, Einstein sat at his desk. The pipe beside him gone cold, the yellow lamplight spilling across a sheet crowded with equations. Outside, young physicists debated quantum mechanics, the theory he had never fully accepted. At 71, he was still working, still walking the same quiet path each morning to the Institute for Advanced Study. His steps were slow but steady, crunching over dry leaves. He wore his old coat with the collar turned up, no hat, no gloves. Everyone greeted him with reverence. He nodded in return, gentle-eyed, yet distant. To the world, he was a living legend. To himself, he was merely a man still trying to place the final piece in an unfinished mosaic, the unified field equation. The dream he had pursued for more than 20 years. But quantum mechanics had triumphed. The new generation Heisenberg, Dirac, Pauli, and Bohr had redrawn the map of reality. In their universe, particles no longer obeyed certainty. Probability had replaced law. For Einstein, this was a paradox. He respected their brilliance, but could not believe the universe was governed by chance. He often told his students that behind every chaos lies an order not yet understood. He did not argue angrily, but spoke with the calm conviction of one who still sensed a hidden rhythm beneath the surface of things. One chilly afternoon in Princeton, Niels Bohr, his friend and intellectual counterpart for 3 decades, came to visit. They walked together along the misted edge of the lake. Bohr spoke of uncertainty, of the possibility that the universe was freer than humanity dared imagine. Einstein smiled and answered softly that what people called randomness might only be a part of a greater order, one too subtle for human minds to grasp. Bohr shook his head, smiling too. There was no debate left between them, only 2 ways of seeing 2 lanterns shining from different sides of the same darkness. Back in the study, they sat by the teapot. The table was scattered with notes. Einstein took a pencil, wrote a few lines, then stopped. He told Bohr that he did not oppose quantum mechanics. He only feared that if humanity accepted chance as the essence of existence, it might lose faith in the harmony of the world. Bohr said nothing. The 2 men, 2 generations, 2 visions sat together like low notes in the same piece of music. Outside, the snow kept falling. The dim light reflected off the walls, casting a soft white glow over Einstein's silver hair, as if the winter itself were listening. A young student walked quietly down the corridor and peeked through the half-open door. Inside, he saw 2 old men seated in silence, surrounded by unfinished equations. They did not speak. From time to time, they smiled the smile of those who understood that every kind of knowledge, no matter how vast, is only the first step toward humility. After that meeting, Einstein told his students that every debate between him and Bohr was like a dance, one partner moving to the rhythm of logic, the other to the rhythm of intuition. And in that dance, both were reaching for the same invisible place, where intellect meets faith, where science touches the edge of belief. He kept that conviction all his life, that the universe is a symphony of immutable laws, and that humankind exists not to command it, but to listen. When journalists asked about his famous remark, he would simply smile and repeat, "God does not play dice with the universe." Then he would add, it was not a statement of religion, but another way of saying that he believed in cosmic order. The world called him the last man of the classical age. But to Einstein, he was merely someone trying to tie together the 2 ends of a single thread, one end called probability, the other meaning. Through the 1950s, he continued to write faithfully, though his health was failing. His hand trembled, his writing slanted, but his eyes still shone. He worked late into the night, stopping only when the lamplight dimmed. A friend who visited said there were always 3 things in his study: a violin, a pipe, and a stack of blank paper. When asked why he persisted in searching for a unified field theory, even though he might never succeed, Einstein replied quietly, "A person does not choose the outcome. They only choose the way." In the afternoons, he often sat by the window looking out at the small garden. Leaves fell, snow melted on the grass, and the light shifted gently in color. At 75, he no longer spoke much about the universe. He cared more about how people treated one another. In letters to friends, he wrote that true progress lay not in technology, but in compassion. That the greater the intellect, the gentler the responsibility must be. Among the final pages of his drafts, one line trembled across the paper. All that is really great and inspiring is created by the individual who can labor in freedom. And below it, in smaller handwriting, everything truly profound is simple, and everything simple is kind. No one knew for whom he wrote those words, perhaps for Bohr, perhaps for himself. One December evening, snow covered the path to the Institute. Einstein left his office, turned off the light, and closed the door. Outside, the wind swept through the trees, carrying a faint sound like the stroke of a violin bow. He stopped and listened. Perhaps in that moment he remembered the long arguments with Bohr, the smile of his old friend, the feeling of living inside the light of thought, even knowing he would never reach its end. He did not win that debate, but he did not lose either. What he kept was his faith that the universe still held order, an order of goodness, of beauty, and of respect. As he walked away from the Institute, snow fell slowly, the lamplight spilling across his gray coat. His figure seemed small, delicate, the final note of a long symphony. In a world where probability had become the language of science, Einstein still chose to believe. To him, every human being, however small, was still a speck capable of questioning the cosmos. And as long as we can still ask, we have not yet lost the way home. Chapter 15. The River of Time. Princeton Spring, 1955. The sky was clear, and the cherry blossoms outside the porch had just begun to bloom. A soft wind passed through, carrying the scent of damp earth and tender grass. Inside the small house at 112 Mercer Street, Einstein rose early as he always did. He brewed tea, sat by the desk, and gathered a few unfinished manuscripts. Morning light spread across the papers, pale gold, warm and still. He was 76 years old. His body had grown frail, his steps slower, yet in his eyes there still flickered the spark of youth. On the desk lay the familiar trio, a pen, a pipe, and a set of incomplete equations. He still believed that one day humanity would unite all the forces of the universe in a single equation. But he also knew it might not happen within his lifetime. That afternoon he walked slowly through the garden. Wild flowers had grown along the fence. Young leaves quivered in the wind. Neighbors often saw him stand for long moments gazing at the sky, as if in quiet conversation with something unseen. To them, he was the great scientist. To himself, he was simply an old man living among memories. When asked why he kept working despite his retirement, Einstein answered that he could not stop thinking, just as a river cannot stop flowing. And he believed that when that river finally stilled, everything would return to silence, as it was before it began. In a letter to an old friend, he wrote about serenity. He no longer feared death. To him, it was only a natural transformation, as water turns into vapor, as light dissolves into space. A visitor once recalled Einstein saying that he did not believe in God in the religious sense, but in the harmony of all things. A place without reward or punishment, governed only by the quiet rhythm of existence. On April 13, 1955, he suffered severe abdominal pain. The doctors diagnosed an aortic aneurysm. When they advised surgery, he refused. He said life had been long enough, and he wished to leave naturally. In the following days, he rested in his room by the window overlooking the garden. On the desk remained his pen and papers. He wrote late into the evening. On one of the final pages, he left a few unfinished lines of equations, the last effort of a lifelong dream of unity. On the morning of April 18th, 1955, Albert Einstein passed away in his sleep. The room was quiet. Morning light streamed through the window, soft upon his gentle face and silver hair. Outside, a bird sang to greet the new day. It's a song light and brief, like a farewell, carried by the dawn. There was no grand funeral. According to his wishes, his body was cremated quietly, and the ashes were scattered over the Delaware River. His brain was kept by Dr. Thomas Harvey for study, believing it might contain the secret to genius. But what Einstein truly left behind was not in his brain tissue. It was in the way he saw the world with simplicity, compassion, and an unshakable faith in reason. Those close to him recalled that not long before his death, he had said his life felt like being given the chance to glimpse a small part of the universe, and that this alone was enough reason to be grateful. The words were never recorded exactly, but everyone remembered the sentiment: gratitude, not regret. A few days later, Princeton was filled with flowers. Students brought branches of white cherry blossoms and laid them at the gates of the institute. No one wept aloud. People simply stood in silence, as if in that stillness they could still hear the faint sound of his old violin carried by the wind. On his desk, the final page remained. The writing is unfinished. The equation is incomplete. But it did not matter. For through 76 years of life, Einstein himself had become a living equation, balancing light and shadow, intellect and kindness. As evening descended, the Delaware River shimmered. The water moved slowly, reflecting the dimming sky. Some said that when his ashes touched the current, the heavens suddenly cleared, as if the entire universe bowed in farewell to the one who had spent his life seeking its harmony. And if some fragment of his soul drifted along that river, perhaps it did not travel far. Perhaps it returned into the breath of the wind, into the light of the day, into the memory of the world. Einstein once believed that energy is never lost, only transformed. In that moment, perhaps that belief became truth. He did not believe in death, only in transformation. The light on his desk faded, but the light he kindled in humankind remained. The story has come to its end. The light on his desk has faded, yet the light within the world still remains. In each of us, perhaps there lingers a small fragment of that same curiosity. The belief that no matter how complex the world may be, it can still be understood through kindness and intellect. Einstein once said that energy is never lost. It only changes form. Perhaps the same is true of memory and of humanity itself. From a speck of dust in a small room in he became part of the breath of the cosmos, where light never ceases to spread. We began this story with light. And now as it dissolves, we understand no light ever truly dies. It merely changes shape, hiding itself within life, within breath, within every gentle motion of humankind. If you are still awake, let your eyes slowly close. Let the sounds drift away until only the heartbeat and the whisper of wind beyond the window remain. If you are already asleep, may your dream carry you onward through soft realms of light, where reason meets compassion and time no longer needs to be measured. Rest gently among lives now, at peace and dreams still unfolding.